I thought it'd be interesting to look in sort of the sub-universe of Fast and the Furious movies, in the sort of the not actually Fast and Furious movies, the rip-offs, the homages, the car movies that are trying to be Fast and Furious, but they're not. Let's get into it. Torque. Fast and Furious with motorcycles, and it wanted to be Fast and Furious so much that the opening scene has tuner cars being beaten by a motorcycle. So yeah, it's a wild movie. It's silly, it's cheesy, it's goofy. The bad guy in it is actually Vince from the Fast and the Furious movies, so that's kind of weird. Ice Cube is also in it. It's a very strange movie. It's very intense. It came out after Too Fast, Too Furious. Redline. Redline is what happens when an Uber producer who has a bunch of money and a bunch of exotic cars wants to make a Fast and the Furious movie with exotic cars. So this is just Fast and the Furious with exotic cars. It's worth noting that the original title for the first Fast and the Furious movie was called Redline, so there's that. It's also worth noting that Eddie Griffin, the comedian who stars in this movie, in a promotion ahead of the movie's premiere, crashed the producer's ultra-rare Ferrari Enzo and totaled it. And so there were 400 Ferrari Enzos when they first got made. There's certainly one less after this movie. Need for Speed. Now, Need for Speed is kind of interesting because Need for Speed, the video game, sort of coincided the whole like tuner culture with the Fast and the Furious movies and Too Fast and the Furious, that whole thing. And so there was the Fast and the Furious movies, and then there was Need for Speed, the video games, and they sort of fed off of each other and sort of hyped each other up. And everybody was calling for a Need for Speed movie. But by the time the Need for Speed movie came out, the Fast and Furious franchise had sort of evolved to what it's sort of become now. And the Need for Speed franchise, the video game franchise, had sort of evolved in a different direction. And then we get this DreamWorks Need for Speed movie, which is kind of just okay and plasticky, and credit to Michael Keaton because he's the sort of radio DJ character who narrates the whole thing, and he absolutely crushes it. But otherwise, this movie is just kind of there, and it's pretty predictable. It is what it is. The Transporter. Now, The Transporter came out after the first Fast and the Furious, and it's European, it's Luc Besson, it's kind of a different movie. It's got Jason Statham in it, and I think that's worth mentioning since he is now a mainstay in the Fast and Furious world. But what if Fast and Furious was sort of a hard-boiled kung fu actioner with practical stunts? You know, sort of the opposite of what the new Fast and Furious is. It's an interesting movie that went on to have a franchise of its own set of movies that are honestly more like Fast and the Furious now than the old Fast and the Furious movies. And also, the guy who plays Vince in the Fast and Furious franchise, the bad guy in Torque, was also the bad guy in The Transporter. His name is Matt Scholes. Good for him, this guy works. Drive. If Fast and the Furious was an art house, understated, brutal actioner. Baby Driver. If Fast and Furious was a tightly choreographed musical. Triple X. So Triple X is a weird one because it was really supposed to be the American James Bond, but really it's much more like the current Fast and Furious movies in that it's sort of these stunt-based action movies that are really high concept and kind of silly, kind of goofy. Also, Vin Diesel stars in the first one. The director of the first Fast and Furious directed the first Triple X. He didn't come back for the second one, which, Vin Diesel was not available, I assume because he was making Fast and Furious movies, but they brought in Ice Cube. Again, Ice Cube was in Torque. Death Race. So Death Race I don't actually think of as a Fast and the Furious movie, but I think it's worth mentioning because it has Jason Statham and Tyrese in it. But I do want to track sort of the lineage of Death Race, which is, it's basically the car version of Gamer. They're basically the same world, a future dystopia where prisons are run privately, and there's this like game show where the participants, if they win enough, they get their freedom, and it's rigged and blah, blah, blah. But Death Race itself is actually sort of a spiritual sequel or a rehashing of Death Race 2000, which was a Sly Stallone, sort of like road rally, brutal, like B-movie. And itself was sort of a tip of the hat to the 1960s Japanese mangas. I point to Speed Racer, which the Wachowskis finally got onto screen at some point. So Speed Racer I really like. It's very visually interesting. It's very silly. I think it approximates the Japanese manga good enough. But so yeah, I don't really consider Death Race, Gamer, Death Race 2000, and Speed Racer to be strictly in the sub-universe of Fast and the Furious, but I thought it was interesting that Death Race especially had Jason Statham and Tyrese, who are now, Fast and Furious for sure. And now we get to the ultra-low budget world where I think stuff gets actually very interesting. Born to Race, which is spelled Born, T-O, Race and everything, but then if you actually look at the poster, it's Born to the number 2 Race. Again, Too Fast, Too Furious. I think they were going for that. But if you actually watch the movie, the plot is a lot more like Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, where he gets in trouble for street racing and has to go live with his estranged father, who happens to be a car guy in a different car culture. Born to Race actually got a sequel, Born to Race Fast Track, which has nothing to do with the first movie. It's a completely different story about young street racing kids who are trying to get onto a circuit professionally. And so most of the story is basically the plot of Top Gun, where they're trying to compete to get a specific race car seat at like a track. So it's kind of like the most pragmatic version of street racer turned professional racer, which is definitely not Fast and the Furious in its execution, but I thought it was worth mentioning. And so I just said Born to Race Fast Track. This other movie is called Fast Track No Limits. So we have Born to Race Fast Track No Limits. So Fast Track No Limits has absolutely nothing to do with the Born to Race series, and it may be the most interesting thing. The trailer blew my mind. Here's the greatest hits from the trailer.
Are these races illegal?
And this.
First rule of racing, never look back. What's behind you doesn't matter.
What if it catches up?
That's what the gas pedal's for.
Also this.
If I win, I want your hand.
And there's also a sex scene in the trailer. It's wild. It's on YouTube. I'm gonna watch it as soon as I'm done with this because this looks fascinating. It looks like the Room version of Fast and the Furious, which I'm here for. Yeah. I also grabbed the screen grab. They talk about robbing a bank, but it definitely looks like they just ran out of a 7-Eleven because it definitely says 11 up there. Maybe that's a bar, maybe that's a bank. Definitely is giving me 7-Eleven vibes though. But yeah, when it comes to copying the Fast and the Furious movies, I think the movies themselves are the best at copying themselves. I don't think there's much question about that. They do the same thing, only harder every single time, and it just keeps evolving into an increasingly more ridiculous sort of stew of what used to be cars, but it's now mostly just exotic stunts. I think it's worth mentioning, though, that the original Fast and the Furious was basically the same premise as Point Break, so here's that. And then also, since Edgar Wright got mentioned because of Baby Driver, here's that. Yeah, so that's the sub-universe of the Fast and Furious franchise. What movies on this list have you seen? Have you seen any of them? Are you going to go watch Fast Track No Limits because it's on YouTube? I'm so excited to go watch it. What do you guys think? I'll catch you next time.